everybody. Welcome to the Best Practices for Work Sampling Online. It's a mid-year check-in. My name is Dr. Melissa Shamblott, and I'll be the instructor for the course. Thank you for taking time for joining us. I know it's a busy time of year, but we wanted to connect with you about some of the things that we would recommend, and hope you will have some time to think about now. Most of you would have completed your first collection period by now, maybe getting ready to do your second collection period, but there's some things we wanted to discuss with you just in terms of best practices to help ensure that you are implementing work sampling online using all the tools and features, and also some things that are a little bit more related to the quality of the implementation and the kind of information that you're putting into the system. Today's session is designed for both administrators and teachers, and if you've participated in our sessions in the past, you know I kind of toggle between both administrator and teacher, pointing out things that would be relevant to both or either along the way, and today's session will be the same way. I'm going to start with a couple of slides just so we can begin to think about what does the quality implementation look like and what are some things that you might be doing at this point in the year. And then we'll shift over to the online site and take a closer look at some of the features and tools, and as we talk about some of the important processes to ensure high quality, we'll touch on them while we're over in the site as well as here in the slides. Our session today is going to cover these following topics, what we would call reviewing and monitoring work sampling data. And again, it assumes that most of you, if not all of you participating today, have some kind of work sampling information or data in the system, whether it be observations or completed checklists. Perhaps you've been busy uploading work samples from children or photographs or videos. And some of you, if you're using the summary report, may have already completed a summary report for the first collection period. So when we're talking about the work sampling data, that's what we're talking about. And I have some information for you to help you think about what to sort of review and monitor, and then some ideas and tips for actually carrying out those processes. We're also going to talk a little bit about how to use all the information that's being collected, the collected evidence or data, or here I'm using the term data reports, to plan for children's learning. A lot of our emphasis in work sampling is sort of getting to the end of the collection period and inputting information, but as you might remember from earlier training or even some of our conversations together, there's lots of really wonderful things we can be doing along the way to use all the information that's being gathered or collected, such as observation notes, photos, work samples, to help guide children's learning, to continue the process of goal setting, to think about developmentally appropriate practices and how we can really individualize the learning experience for children. So we'll talk a little bit about that in relationship to the kinds of information that's being gathered for the work sampling system, and also reflecting a bit on the different aspects of the assessment cycle and where we might have information to help guide that process of planning for children's ongoing learning. There's also data reports. Once teachers have input developmental checklists one time and done what we call finalize, which we will be sure to review once we get into the system, there's lots of really wonderful reports. Some are over on the teacher side and some over on the admin side, but wherever they're gathered from, they're really valuable for thinking about how children are doing, but also, again, thinking a little bit more about how can we use this wonderful data to plan ongoing experiences for children, interactions, maybe bringing new materials into the classroom environment, but also being able to use the data to take a look at how things are going for groups of children by age level. Sometimes we're interested in looking at how an entire site is doing in terms of a developmental domain or specific part of the checklist. And from the data, we can also glean a lot of information about different patterns and trends, such as if we're noticing that lots of children are getting a not yet rating in a particular indicator or a cluster of indicators or even a whole domain, that's very valuable information for making some decisions or doing a little more investigating as to why that might be, and thinking about what can we do to help more children achieve in-process or proficient ratings. The last thing we'll do, and this will be sort of done alongside everything else, is just wanting to show you the online tools and making sure you're familiar with all the different features that are available to you, and thinking about the professional development section on the teacher side and all the wonderful videos and resources that are available too. I know for many of you, especially those of you who are new to the work sampling system implementation process, the beginning of the year can be kind of a hectic time where oftentimes we're just really focused on getting up and running. And as a result of that, sometimes we're not as aware or we're just not able to earlier on to focus on some of the features that might be of real benefit to you or interest to you at this time. And now that you have a little bit of time to sort of reflect on what you've done already this year and thinking forward to what else you might like to do, being aware of these features can be particularly helpful. And again, you may just be in a better place now to begin to take a closer look at the system and all that it has to offer to you. We're going to start again with the reviewing and monitoring. I'll move right into that. So we think about reviewing and monitoring as part of a process of ensuring high-quality assessment practices. What we know from research on work sampling is that it's implemented to the best of its ability, or the best of our ability, if you will, when a couple things happen, when teachers are prepared or have some level of training to implement work sampling, and also when there is a process of making sure that the information input into the system is accurate and complete, and having a sense to kind of step back and notice, are all the domains being covered, are all the areas that we're interested in gathering data on being done in completion. And so we want to make sure we can achieve that high quality assessment practices both through the training as well as through that kind of checks and balances. And there's things for both administrators and teachers to do within this realm. In fact, the things I'll introduce you to I would recommend for both teachers and administrators, just in terms of becoming more familiar and aware of what's in the system or what kind of information is being input into the system. Maybe for some of you who aren't using all the features, it will be a time of raised awareness about the kind of information that can go in, and then some ideas about how to make sure it's high quality, make sure it reflects truly what children are doing or matches up well with the developmental checklist, for instance. Also, because in most programs that we work with, there are lots of different teachers, often in different locations, different sites, and in some cases, for many of our clients, your teachers are spread across an entire state. So people are a lot of different places, and in terms of reflecting on that high quality and hoping to achieve an optimal level, it's important that everyone using the tool is implementing it in the same way, using it what we might consider properly, the way it was designed to be used. We want to make sure teachers are using it consistently across collection periods within a single classroom, but also consistently in terms of across multiple classrooms or multiple sites or multiple locations within a state. And then that accuracy is important as well in terms of making sure the information in the observations and other collected evidence is accurate, as well as an emphasis on making sure that the developmental checklist ratings are accurate and reflect where children truly are along a learning continuum. So those are all areas to focus on, and when we go into the system to take a look around, we'll have a chance to reflect a little bit more on those three areas. Another reason to engage in this process of reviewing and monitoring, and again, I really feel it's important for both administrators and teachers to be engaged in this process, is it's a wonderful way to engage in a conversation, and for administrators to provide teachers with ongoing support and feedback. Something along the lines of, hey, I was just in the system and I noticed all the wonderful observation notes that you've included, or it was really fun to see all the work samples you've uploaded. Or for teachers who may not yet be using that part of the system but have input developmental checklist ratings, I mean, even just a comment, I know it looks like you did a great job getting all your checklist ratings finalized for the fall collection period. So I think it lends itself well to a conversation and a dialogue about the kind of things that ought to be in the system in terms of each program's expectations for teachers. You know, how many domains you're using might vary a little bit by location. So giving feedback around meeting those expectations, but then even more specifically being able to speak to what's there and how it looks and how you as a program are moving in terms of expectations around what should be included. For example, in some programs they might start off the year with the expectation that checklist ratings are what should be in the system initially, with the hope that perhaps by second collection period that teachers might begin to experiment a little bit more with the online observation features or uploading a few photos or work samples. And so sometimes programs have kind of a staggered implementation plan, and so having a chance to look over what's in the system and reflecting on what else you might like to see there, it lends itself well to a conversation either at a staff meeting or a one-on-one with teachers or clusters of teachers. I know a lot of times teachers work together collaboratively in a prep meeting or some other type of grade level planning meeting and may be able to have some of these conversations amongst themselves around what should be there, what's there, how it's going, and how things look. And then finally, something I've already touched on, I'm thinking a little bit about the patterns and trends that we can begin to see with data. Even after one collection period, we can begin to detect different patterns and trends that can be very helpful in terms of our ongoing interest in professional development, if there's areas that teachers don't have as much information about in terms of a developmental domain or what kind of learning might be represented within a domain, or maybe needing more information about specific checklist indicators and what that looks like in the classroom. We can use that information to plan for ongoing learning for staff. We can also use the information to think about the children that we're serving and the kinds of things that we're seeing, and maybe make some decisions about program enhancements that might be valuable as a reflection or as a result of looking over the data. All right, so I'm going to move one more slide ahead. We're going to go into the online system in just a moment here. When we go in, we'll take special notice of all three areas, and of course, if you're familiar with the system, you're recognizing this as the teacher side of the system. We've got the observations and work samples, often referred to as the collected evidence, guidelines and checklists here in this middle area, and then the reports, which would include the summary report as well as the data reports that are available on the teacher's side. Some of the reports are available only on the teacher's side, and then there are some that administrators can access on their side that are more specific to multiple sites or multiple classrooms, things that teachers generally wouldn't be as concerned with. A teacher is able to run a report about his or her class or classes. You could see that data combined together as long as the children are the same age or grade level, whereas an administrator has a few more tools to work with to make it easier to look across sites or across classrooms. All right, let me show one slide, and then we'll go in onto the system and take a look. When we first get there, one of the things we're going to take a peek at, and this is a place to start in terms of reviewing and monitoring, is I know, again, in the beginning of the school year, depending how the information for the children was input into the system, I mean, sometimes that's done manually by teachers and or administrators. Sometimes an administrative assistant is involved in that process. So there's different ways for that information to get into the system, but one of the things to do to ensure a high level of accuracy is just to make sure that your demographics are accurate. Is the information for each child accurate? Beyond sort of correct names, spellings, and things like that, we want to take a look, making sure the birth date is correct, any ethnicity and language fields. I know sometimes in the beginning of the year, the information that's required to input is sometimes put in, and people may not either have access at that moment to the ethnicity and language information or may decide to go back and do that. And so if that was a decision that you've made, this would be a great time to go back and do that and make sure that you have as much information about each child in the system as possible. In part, that's because we can run reports based on the ethnicity and language groupings that children are assigned to, but only if that information is in the system. So if that was something that you skipped over earlier, this would be a time to go back to do that. Another thing that can happen, and sometimes this is revealed to us, if we begin to notice a pattern of a lot of children getting a not yet rating, and of course it's true, I just want to say that in the beginning of the year, we typically do see more not yet ratings for children because, as you may recall, the developmental checklists represent what we would hope for children at the end of the school year. So, for example, the preschool 4 guidelines reflect what we hope children will achieve by the end of the 4-year-old year, and the kindergarten checklist reflects what we would hope for kids at the end of the kindergarten year. So we do tend to see more not yet ratings in the beginning of the year than we do in either of the other 2 collection periods. However, having said that, sometimes if we pick up on a pattern or a trend as where, almost every child in class is getting a not yet rating in something, or some child is really getting mostly not yets in everything, we might just want to take a look. Sometimes it's because the wrong checklist has been selected. So, for example, for those of you working with 3-year-olds, if you're noticing that, maybe the preschool 4 checklist was inadvertently selected. So sometimes that's something to be resolved. And then the last thing to look for is those children who have an IEP, an individual education plan, or an IFSP, individual family plan. You want to make sure that that's indicated in the system. You can run reports to look at how those children are doing compared to children without IEPs, and it also gives you some other opportunities in terms of different kinds of summary reports that can be pulled together, but only if that type of information is indicated when we input the student data. And of course, in the system, you can always go back in and make the changes. If you realize someone didn't get checked for an IEP and they have one, you can check it. Or sometimes children are just being just now we're learning that they have special needs that warrant an individual education plan, so you could always go back in now and make that selection for someone who may not have even had one previously in the year. All right. When we go in, and we'll take a look at 2 slides, and then we'll go in, and then we'll hop back out and look at some of these other features. When we go in, we'll look for the demographics initially, and we'll also look for the observations. When we go in, and just in general, whether you have your observation notes in the online system, or I know many of you are recording observations on mailing labels or in notebooks or with other methods or tools, maybe even using some of the graphic organizers available in the online system and printing them out and using them to do more handwritten notes. These are things to look for to make sure that they're being done well, making sure they're being done accurately, and helping you to gather the kind of information that tends to be most useful in terms of making a good, accurate checklist rating. So we always want to make sure that the notes are dated. In the online system, that's automatically a part of the system. When you put it in, the date is automatically there. It can be adjusted. A big one is, are the notes factual? This is one of the really, really important ones around any kind of collected observation or anecdotal notes, brief notes, running records, anything like that where we're jotting down information. We always want to make sure that it's factual, and we use the guides. If it's something that you can see or something that you can hear, it's typically a factual note. Of course, that does rely on us recording it that way, but we want to try to avoid interpreting things too early in the process or using our opinions. So we stick to the facts, things we see and things we hear. And when we go and look at our observations, that's one of the things we can review our notes for. If you are going to take some time to do that and you'd come across something where you've inserted an opinion or it's a little more interpretive, no big deal. What we do is we just simply ask ourselves, and we might be reflecting back now if it was taken at some point earlier, thinking about exactly what we saw and what we heard. And usually by adding more details to a note, we can make it more factual. So that would be something important to look for, and that's also something Often in the first year, for those of you who are first-year implementers, that's often something about this time after you've had your first opportunity to complete one collection period that it's important to go back and do, and just make sure that going forward you're recording factual observation notes. We also want to make sure that depending on your program's implementation requirements, that you're using all the required domains. I mean, if you've asked to use all 7, then you want to make sure you have some observations collected for all. And there's a really neat feature that I'll show you online that helps you very visually in a graphic form see how many observations you have for each domain. It's also very helpful because it helps you to see those domains where you may not have very many or any in some cases observation notes. We want to record things about what children were saying or doing. A lot of times we see dictation notes where teachers have recorded exactly word for word what kids have said in quotation marks, which is important to always include. And then again, thinking a little bit about something we'll touch on a little later in the webinar, just sort of asking that question, are you as teachers, or if you're an administrator, are your teachers using their observational data to plan for children's learning? I know sometimes we're left with the feeling that the observation notes are just used so we can complete the checklist and may not have any value beyond that, but really all along the way we want to be reviewing and looking over our observational notes so we can continue that process of planning for individual children. And another way to think about that is because our checklists aren't due until the end of the collection period, we don't want to wait that whole time to plan individually appropriate activities and experiences. We need to be doing that planning, weekly, if not daily for children. So getting in that habit of not just collecting notes to complete a checklist, but collecting notes and finding a time to review the notes and using that information to do that kind of planning. All right, we're going to head into the online system now. And so I've already logged in here, and I first am in as an administrator, but I'm going to quickly toggle over to the field where I can access my class. Today we're going to be going to the school readiness class again. Perhaps you were there with me last time. And now we can see evidence, guidelines, and checklists and reports. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look here with our widget. We're going to stop to see the kind of information that we have in for our students. And when we look down, we can see names. We could see correct name spellings here. We could also click on each child's name and get a little more information about that child. As you scroll down, you can see birth date and things like that. Here's a little box. If you had a child with an IEP or an IFSP, you would just simply click there. And then here are the fields for language and ethnicity. So again, it's very common in the beginning of the year teachers may not have that information, or the person inputting the student data may not have time in that first moment to do that. And so this is a great time to go back and do that. The other thing here, and I'll just point it out, it's just an additional tool and feature, but since we're right here now, I'll mention it. There is a wonderful tool, a family gallery, that you can invite families if you want. It's up to each program to determine whether or not you want to use this part of the system. But you can invite families to set up a little gallery for their child where they can input photos or videos, or if they have the equipment to do scanned work or things like that. Sometimes parents will have that kind of equipment at a workplace, or some even in their home. But anyway, it allows you to engage with families in a conversation about whether or not they would like to partner with you about putting information into a separate gallery. And the nice thing about it is it allows you as teachers and administrators to see what families are putting in. Let me be clear, though. The families can never see what the teacher has put into the system. You're allowed to see what they've uploaded, but it stops there. And if you want something that they've uploaded, you can then move it over and put it in with the rest of your collected evidence. So we can see what they put in, but they can never see what we have in our system. So that confidentiality and security that we want and need is still kept at a very, very high level. So in terms of looking over the demographics, this would be one place to go. If you do discover, for example, that the wrong age level was selected, that example I was giving earlier about a child who is receiving mostly not yet, and you know, investigating a little bit about why and then come across that the wrong checklist was selected. No big deal. You just simply make that change here. You would want to switch it to preschool 3 if it had been inadvertently selected at preschool 4. So that's sometimes something that happens. And then we will just back right out of here. So this is a place to go to look at information about the student. So that's an important piece of making sure that the information in the system is accurate, and I guess that would also speak to a sense of sort of completeness. We want to make sure that all of our data is complete as we move forward. So then the next area we're going to look at is we'll go back to our widget. Now we're going to go in and take a peek at the evidence area. So this is where we can go to, at a glance, to see all of the evidence. We use the word evidence, collected evidence. Sometimes we refer to it as data. What we're referring to are observation notes, work samples, photos, are doing throughout the collection period could be considered evidence. And so here we are seeing all the evidence that this teacher has put in. We can also choose to filter the evidence by either by students, just to see what's been selected or what's been put in for an individual student, or for an entire reporting period. So that's an important feature to play around with. When we click on the name of the actual piece of evidence, we can see here I selected Joey. I can see the date that the observation was made. I can see it's for period 1. I can see the title. I can read through the actual observation here under the word description to ensure that I have included factual information. If you're looking back at past observations, it's best practices if it's in the collection period that you're currently in, if it's in collection period 2, I think it's permissible to make it more factual. If you're looking all the way back, though, to the fall collection period and you've already made your fall checklist ratings, I would advise not to change it now, but moving forward, just pay more attention to writing factual notes. We don't want to really change something that was used to guide a checklist rating, and it really wouldn't have any huge value at this point to go back and change past observation notes. But moving forward, we wanted to include more fact, and certainly those observations that have been collected for the current collection period could be improved with more detail, more fact, and some of the opinions or interpretations could be removed. We also see here, in this case, I've uploaded a sample of work, a photo of the child. I've also done some linking this observation to performance indicators, and so this is another important piece of the puzzle. When we click here, we have the opportunity to make a selection of different domains. I'm going to select mathematical thinking here for this example, and I can then read through and see all of the checklist indicators. And I come down to this one because what we were just looking for Joey had a lot to do with patterns. I can see that this would be an appropriate selection to make. I can also click here on this little blue link for guidelines, and I can be taken to the page from the developmental guidelines that talks about this particular indicator. I can read the rationale. Remember this important rationale which we use to guide our evaluative rating, and then different kinds of examples that reflect what children who have reached that proficient level might look like, or the kinds of things they would be doing to demonstrate proficiency. One of the things to note that although the work we just viewed for Joey truly does reflect patterns, when I'm looking more closely at what it says for the indicator and it says in the guidelines, I can see that it's not just about recognizing patterns, but this indicator also includes this piece about making simple generalizations. So one of the things I would want to do as a teacher is I would want to go back over my observation, continue to review my information. I can clearly see that Joey's making patterns, but I don't have a lot of information about here of whether or not the child is making generalizations. so I could improve my observations, or I could put it on my list for things to look for moving forward in terms of if Joey is making generalizations, maybe I'm going to ask a few questions to see what the child's understanding is around that. So it kind of prompts my next steps as a teacher in terms of additional information that I want to gather, and also making sure that by the time I get to the end of the collection period, I have the right kind of information to do a good job making that checklist indicator. I would want to know whether or not that generalization piece was also in place before I could determine whether or not this child was proficient. With what we have here, I could certainly discern that this child is at least in process because they are making patterns, and that is part of the indicator. But without that generalization piece, I wouldn't be able to determine whether or not the child was proficient. So when we review our observations and other collected evidence, it really does provide us with a lot of information to guide our next steps in terms of what we plan for children, but also guiding our next steps in terms of what we do as work samplers in terms of the kinds of information we look for, the kinds of questions we might ask ourselves or ask children. So that was one thing that I wanted to point out, the demographics as well as looking over the observation notes. I'm going to go in again now, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about developmental checklists. We'll talk about this, and then towards the end of our session when we back out of the online system, we'll take a look at some of the other slides that I have available. So when we're thinking about developmental guidelines and checklists and we want to review and monitor and make sure the information is in place, there's a couple different things that we can do. And this would be true for both teachers and administrators. Again, we see the names of our children, we see the grade level or age level that was selected. We can also see things like, for example, this child's checklist is final. So I could go ahead and I could click on that link, and then I see this is all for Ashley Cooper. What this is telling us is the first collection period is complete. I can see that 12 out of 12, 16 out of 16. I can, at a glance, see that all the indicators are complete. I can also see with this green bar that the checklist has been finalized, which is important. If the checklist is not finalized, it means that this child's checklist data would not be included in some of the reports that I would run. So we always want to make sure it's final. And just a moment with another student, I'm going to show you how to do that if you're not familiar with that process yet. Something else I can do is I can go in, I can take a look this way at all of my checklist indicators. I can take note of whether or not there's any evidence collected that was linked to this particular checklist indicator. In this case, I can see there was an observation and a work sample uploaded, so I can take a peek at that. I can also look at the pattern of ratings this way. I can scroll down and see the rest of my checklist here, and I can also note whether or not any comments were made at the time the teacher completed this section of the checklist. The comments that are recorded here are something that then automatically become available over on the summary report. So for programs that have teachers doing both developmental checklist ratings and the summary report, it's a nice feature because it connects the checklist to the summary, and it also saves time for the teacher in that when you work through a whole domain and you've looked over all the child's evidence for this domain, you're really thinking a lot about this child in this moment, and it's a really good time to record your thoughts, maybe write something that you would want to share with this child's family or something you want to remember when you get over to the summary report. Then when you get to the summary report, if you want to use this comment, it's a very easy process. You just click a little button and this sentence automatically appears in the narrative section of your summary. So it is a time saver, and this is a good time to be thinking about those examples or those special things that you know you're going to want to include. So this is one way to review checklist data. So things to be thinking of, we would want to make sure that the teacher has completed all the checklist ratings. We would also want to make sure that all the domains that are required have been completed. Whether or not they use that comment box is it's usually left up to personal preference of the teacher. It might be the program requirement that everyone will complete a summary report and include narrative, but that comment box is usually something that programs will leave up to the teacher as to whether or not that's a handy tool. There's different ways to complete narrative, and that's just one of the ways. Another way to review checklist data, though, would be to go over to the reports, where we have here on the teacher side different options for looking at reports that pull together checklist data. And so administrators, there's first two reports that I'm going to show are things that you can only see when you're over here on the teacher side. The first is what we would call the class ratings, and this one requires a little bit of a setup. Let me just give it a simple name, ratings. I have to also select my age or grade level. That's because in the system, and I'm just going to quick select one domain to make the process go more quickly, and I quickly will select submit. And let me do one thing here. Let me increase this a little bit for you. Okay, so I was just going to mention that if you serve 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds in your program, their data will always be separate, and that's because the 3-year-old and the 4-year-old checklists are different. The rationales are different. The examples are different, and so the system won't combine that data. That's why we had to make that selection. Did we want to see 3 or 4 or another age or grade level? So it's a little larger here. You can at least see the basic details. This is for personal social. Here's our functional components. Here are our performance indicators. And here are the names of children. And so while we could go one by one through each child's checklist, and that is valuable, one thing we can see is how the observations were linked and what kind of evidence was collected for each indicator. Here we can see, though, more readily and a little more quickly the pattern of ratings. We can see that a couple kids don't have any ratings. But if we're interested in looking for some of those patterns and trends, this type of report can be a little bit easier to review because all the information's here. And so 1, 2, and 3, those are our collection periods. And right now we can see the teacher only has information for this first collection period. So over time, we'll be getting to see patterns from left to right. We can see here that for Ashley, she got an in process, an in process, an in process, in process, couple of proficients. We can see here for this child, Austin O'Connor, that although he started with an in process and self-confidence, that he's a child who has a couple of not yets, perhaps nothing other than he just not developed those skills yet, but it's always important to just be aware of the patterns of data and to use that information then to, if you feel like you want to do any follow-up or you want to make sure that if the child needs additional supports, that they're available. It does provide you with a lot of information quickly, which then gives you information to provide feedback for teachers and to have some of those conversations. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we will minimize that down. The other report that you might be interested in looking at, and again, this one can only be seen over here on the teacher side, is this one called the class profile. Again, we need to do a little bit of selecting to get it set up. And teachers, this is a really excellent one for planning, instructional strategies, for if you have any sort of assistant or interns or people supporting you or helping you out in the classroom. It can be really, really valuable to share with them in terms of giving them some ideas about who you would want them to work with. So what we have here, again, we're still in personal and social development, first functional component, first performance indicator. Here we can see the pattern of ratings, not yet, in process, proficient, not applicable. Again, that one is used when we've not yet introduced children to content involved in the indicator. If we've not covered something, we don't want to be assessing it. It could also be used if there's a cluster or a couple of indicators that are deemed not appropriate for a child with identified special needs. We might opt for not applicable. It is simply saying that for this child, this one is not an appropriate or not applicable indicator. And for those students with the IEPs, that's usually what their IEP is all about. There's very specific goals and objectives designed for their special needs, and so these indicators aren't as necessary if it's being covered in another area or teachers are assessing those in other ways. And then the did not observe, again, just as it suggests, times when we've just not had that opportunity to observe children, maybe they're newer to the class or we've just not seen them relative to a certain indicator, we always advise not to guess. It would be better to say, I didn't observe it, and to make a plan to look for that in the next collection period. So this is another way to see checklist indicator information. It can be very, very helpful for planning, pairing children. Maybe you're going to pair your not yet kids with your proficient kids. And so this is simply just the checklist information reflected back to you. So things to review and look for would be completion of domains, completion of indicators, and then using some of these data reports to get a better idea of how children are doing. I do want to go back here for 1 minute to the evidence. Another way to glean information about children is to use a new feature that was more recently added, this summary chart here. I mentioned it earlier, a really wonderful way to visually see who we've gathered information for and who we've not. And then, of course, this reflects the kind of information that is stored in the online system, so it assumes you're using those features and those tools in the system, and also linking them to the checklist, because then the system can go through and reflect back to you with this type of summary where you have observations connected. And when you hover over each color, now you can see I've got one observation for personal social, I've got one for the arts, and I have 4 here for physical development, health, and safety for Ashley. So all the children in the class's names are listed here. I can also see that there's several kids that I don't have any information for. And, of course, the key is over here. So this can be very helpful. Administrators, I think this can be a useful tool for you just to get a sense of the kinds of online observations that are being linked up to the developmental checklist. And it could be used, again, for professional development. I mean, maybe you would notice something, for example, that teachers just really aren't doing a lot of scientific thinking observations online, and so maybe at the next staff meeting you could talk about that and find out why are they saving that information in another way, and maybe a more physical folder in the classroom where they have all their scientific thinking observations, or maybe that's an area that's more challenging for them and they're not really sure what to write about, which could lead to some wonderful conversations. Maybe it would lead to a couple of times getting together to look over that section in the developmental guidelines, reading that carefully together, talking about the indicators and making sure teachers know when children are demonstrating scientific thinking, but also how to set up the classroom to support and foster that kind of learning. So the data is going to be very, very very, very informative at all levels and can be very helpful and valuable really for all aspects of our implementation, whether it's the work we do directly with children, the work we do together as teams, the work we do within our organizations with administrators, teachers, and other support staff. Another area that we would look at in terms of reviewing and monitoring would be the class outcomes report, and this is one that I'll show you here because it will generate more quickly. This is one, administrators, that you can generate on your side with even more options for selections. But when we make more options, it can take a little longer to generate, and so I'll just show it to you here. So when you are ready to put together an outcome report, you have the option of seeing things at the domain level, functional component level, or performance indicator level. So depending on how much data you want or what you're really interested in, sort of reflecting on your reason for running the report in the first place, can be very valuable to you. I'm going to unselect some of these domains here. Again, with fewer things to look for, the system will move more quickly for us, and I'm going to just get it down so that we're only looking at this school readiness class that we've already been studying. And I'm going to go ahead and submit. And you can see this feature here for grouping. That's the feature that allows you to see things by the ethnicity or the language groups that you select. So that's why that information is so important to make sure you have in the system when you're thinking about the demographics. So I'm going to kind of go quickly through these first few pages if you've not seen an outcome report. It has a lot of information sort of on the front end to help a reader of the report understand the demographics we work with in the online system, and it gives a little bit more sort of overview information. It also provides you with wonderful demographic survey information, active, gender. Here are your language and ethnicity groups. As you move down a little bit more, you can begin to see the completion rate. Again, keeping in mind we selected performance indicator level. We can just at a glance see all of the indicators were completed. So that can be helpful, that completion rate. This would be a place and time to note if you weren't seeing 100%, you could do a little bit of follow-up on, maybe one teacher missed a few indicators or skipped a child, so that could be important, and it's long. Let's get this little guy down here. Whoops. All right, so then here's another bit of information. So here we're beginning to see the mean rating. Whoops. And so the way that the mean rating is, the system automatically averages all the information. And so they're looking over how all the children were rated, for example, in this particular indicator, participates in the group life of the class. And after the system looks over all those checklist indicators, it comes up with what's called the mean rating. So it's kind of averaging all the ratings. And so a 1 would equal a not yet, a 2 equals in process, and a 3 equals proficient. And so the fact that we have a 1.67 means that children overall, when average, did better than not yet, but a little less than in process. So kids were somewhere getting not yet and in process ratings. This 1, 2, and 3 here reflects the collection periods, first collection or fall, winter, spring. And then over time, as we have more information, the system will calculate the gains that children are making from collection period 1 to collection period 2. It will provide you with information on the growth, and so you can quickly eyeball that to see those indicators, or if you would have selected domain or functional component, it gives you that information about the growth that's made. And again, that can be very, very helpful for charting areas where there's lots of growth or noting areas where there's very little growth. And again, that can lead to information about things that you might want to do in professional development or staff meetings in terms of making sure you're supporting teachers, making sure they're having all the information. Here for another indicator, manages transitions. In addition to all that mean rating and the gains rating, we also begin to see the bar graphs for each child. So in this case, for this indicator, we can see the pattern of rating for the children that are in the system. This classroom does not have very much data in the system, so we're not seeing all the children or the entire class. But I selected fall, winter, spring so that you could get the idea that over time, here's fall, then we'll see winter, and then we'll see spring. And, of course, we're looking for fewer and fewer children over time having not yet ratings, more and more children becoming proficient by the end of the year. So those are things that we can look for. So administrators, again, you can run the class outcomes from here when you're over on the teacher side. You can also go onto your side and make more selections, including all the classrooms, all the groups, all the sites, whomever you want that you oversee. You can include in those reports as long as they are the same age or grade level. All right, so let's go back here. I wanted just to stop back here at the home page again just to kind of reorient. So we've had a chance to talk about reviewing and monitoring the collected evidence, thinking about some things relative to the checklist. We can also take a look at the summary reports that teachers have completed. Again, this is if that is a part of the system that you are using. Not all programs use the summary report. You may have some other kind of report card or progress report that you're using. I'm going to just quickly show you, though, a couple features here. So when we were over on Ashley's checklist and I was talking about the comments, this was the little sentence that was in that comment box. And so it's here and it's available, and you can see I've been in and I've made some other narrative comments. But if I wanted to include this sentence as part of my narrative, I would simply click Add Comment, and then it's included. It's here at the bottom. It was added in right here. So that can be really a huge time saver for teachers, and then you would just click Save to save that report. So that's something that you can have a look at. Reading through the narratives can be valuable, especially if your teachers are newer to the system and haven't had that opportunity yet to think about the narrative and the evaluative ratings and how they match up. Those would be things to look for. Do the checklist ratings support the narrative? Do the evaluative ratings, if selected, match up with what the system is saying? For example, if the teacher had marked the child with a lot of not yet ratings, say in personal and social development, and then you're over on the summary report and you notice that they've given the child the as expected rating, you might want to inquire about that, because usually if the child's received all not yet ratings on the checklist, the needs development evaluative rating would be more appropriate on the summary. So making sure there's good consistency between all the parts of the tool, the evidence supporting the checklist ratings and the checklist ratings supporting the summary reports. Another important area to remember in terms of ongoing learning and development, the professional development side on for Teachers is really, really valuable. All sorts of information and embedded videos, including the teacher manual that explains how to implement the work sampling system, can be a wonderful companion for people who are newer to the process of implementing work sampling, and also several sections here on writing narrative comments. Here in this additional resource section, there's an introduction to work sampling. There's also a really nice introduction to work sampling online. So if you're watching me click around and realize you don't know how to do some of the things I'm demonstrating, you might want to take a look at this work sampling online tutorial. It will just walk you through all the steps, all the tabs, all the features to make sure that you're familiar with them at a time that would allow you to look a little bit more closely at them. All right, so I want to just quick zoom up here again, and I want to stop over now back to my home page. And I'm going to hop over here. Now I'm going to head back to admin side. So teachers, you may or may not have, unless you are assigned as an administrator, you may not be able to go over as quickly as I was able to. But there's a few things here that I wanted to point out. On the admin side, administrators can easily look through the student data. The user data, that would refer to the teachers that you're working with. If you just want to make sure that all of this data is clean, emails are in, the assigned roles are appropriate, you can do that. You could also look over data over your locations just to make sure addresses and things like that were in order. You can use your alert tools to send messages to your teachers and others who are assigned administrative functionality. And then you can look at reports, and there's a couple features here that are new for you too. This status report, you can quickly look to see what the number of checklists and or summaries are pending. You'll want to select a period here. And then you can see for this class, the teacher has 12 pending, and she has 22 students to complete, so she had a little bit more work to do. So it's just a way for you to quickly kind of at a glance to see where teachers are at. And I know that would be a great reason to send out an alert, or at your next staff meeting, maybe remind them of the timeline and when you would hope that checklists would be due. Same for summary reports. If there's some kind of timeline, maybe conferences are coming and you want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to complete not only their checklist but their summary for the parent-teacher conference. And then administrators, here are your reports and group extracts. The exports involve all the data in the system, and this is all the information, for example, on your teachers and other assigned administrators. All the information about the students can be exported into an Excel type of sheet. An assessment data export exports all the checklist data. Oftentimes administrators will do that at year end when fall, winter, spring data is in. You might want to export it. We recommend that you do that just to have it in an Excel file. And then your outcomes reports are generated right from here, and very similar to what we saw with teachers, with a few exceptions that you have more flexibility and functionality around what you're able to select in terms of your reports. All right, I'm going to quickly, in our last moment or two here, head back to our checklist ratings. We had a chance to look at talk about our checklist ratings. I wanted just to quickly stop here because oftentimes the most frequently asked question is, how do we know if a child is proficient? I've included this slide again. I had it in the fall slide deck as well, but just to give you a kind of a visual, when we're thinking about proficiency for children on a checklist, although there's no set amount of data required, we are looking to see if a child is reliably demonstrating something. And so when we begin to see several observation notes and some photos, we begin to see a pattern that suggests that the child is doing this on an ongoing basis. So we may not exactly have 6 pieces for every child, but we can begin to see what comprises a proficient. It's when the child is reliably demonstrating the indicator. And so we would want to be checking, whether it be in the classroom or in the online system, that there was enough evidence to support that kind of rating for children. And then as we head towards the end of our session here, I just wanted to go back to the work, and we'll just quick look at this work here that we have for, that was the summary report. To look back to the work that we collected for Joey, this is the work we saw in the online system, and in a slide I've put for you the information, things that we might plan for children as a result of reviewing the information. For someone like Joey who's doing an ABAB, we might introduce more complex patterns. We might make sure that there are more materials brought into the environment, enough for the child to extend on those patterns. Different kinds of activities could be brought in, and again, to that point of wanting to make sure and to discover whether or not Joey is able to make generalizations, since that indicator reflects both making patterns and generalizations. We would want to make sure that we begin that process of talking with the child about the generalization. Not just Joey, but all the other children in the classroom could benefit from that information. And the last slide we're going to have time to look at, we've looked at all of these other things when we were over on the online side. So a couple things for you just in terms of making sure you're using all your online tools and features. Administrators, we would encourage you to visit the classrooms, and virtually that is. Of course, it's always nice to go in person if feasible, but you can visit classrooms in the way I just demonstrated online. Remember to use your alerts. You can check the dashboard for completion rate of checklists and things, and then using the data reports. Remember, there's a couple that you can only view when you're over on the teacher's side. Those ones include the individual names of children, so we have to go to a teacher's classroom to get that level of data. Then over on the admin side, you can generate reports that are aggregated by group or small groups of children, but the names of the children aren't included in those outcome reports. And then teachers, remember to use your professional development section. Explore some of those videos you didn't have time to look at earlier. Take a look at some of those PDFs. Throughout the developmental guidelines, there's lots of wonderful embedded videos for you to get a good idea of what certain indicators look like, and then using your data reports. They're just simply reflections of the checklist data, but in the report form can be very helpful in terms of guiding your next steps in terms of what you do with children, but also in terms of what you do in your work sampling implementation. All right, so that's what we have time for today. Hopefully you have some new ideas about best practices for work sampling online. Gaining familiarity with the system and using all the resources that are available to you are certainly within the realm of best practices, so we hope that this webinar was helpful in moving you to that next step and supporting the work that you're doing. Thank you, everybody.